Who will be the biggest name traded at the NBA's trade deadline? We also had a close night of games in the association, and the Kings, good for you guys, make a smart decision. It's the Wednesday episode of Locked On NBA. Let's go.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the daily podcast covering everything you want to know about the association. And thank you, of course, for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. On Wednesdays, I'm your co-host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and the host of the Locked On Pelicans podcast.
And I'm Tony East, filling in for John Corrales today. I host Locked On Pacers, and both of our teams, Jake, involved in some fun, down-to-the-wire action today.
What a good Tuesday night slate of games we actually had in the NBA. No stinkers, nothing. Well, maybe one or two, but this one was pretty fun. This was a good league pass night. This episode of Locked On NBA is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. So we'll get to those games, those really interesting games in the second segment. We'll talk some Kings in the third segment, but we're just 16 days away from the NBA's trade deadline, which means there's going to be a lot of trade talk, a lot of trade rumors coming out too. And Tony, I don't know about you, but I'm having trouble trying to figure out what's going to happen at this trade deadline. I thought it would be a little crazy at first, but now I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think it's been well reported on, right? A lot of teams think they've got a shot and want to be a buyer, right? I think that, the Pelicans are in this mix, like from 5 to 13 in the West is like 3 losses separate all of those teams. Like the margin from hosting a playoff series and being at home is very small. So all those teams want to be buyers, which means there's very few sellers. There's very few ways to get good stuff to make your team better. And so when that happens, until someone picks a direction to be a seller or something surprising happens, it's a strange one. It's slower right now than normal, though we did just have our first significant move on Monday.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Like with the Wemby draft coming up and Scoot Henderson in that draft too, you figured there'd be a lot of teams outright tanking, and there's some. You got about 5 teams that are like truly bad. There's probably 6 teams you look at and you're like, oh, they're definitely sellers. They have no chance at the postseason whatsoever. But that's not enough to kind of feed the top of the teams that want to make moves to try and be competitive. And you're not seeing as many teams as you might have thought really tank for some of that. So Mark Stein was talking about this in his newsletter on his Substack. And he even said, some of the names to look at are Terry Rozier and Fred VanVleet. Given the weirdness, let's do real or fake, which we do every Wednesday right off of the bat here. Fred VanVleet, real or fake, Tony? Fred VanVleet or Terry Rozier are going to be the biggest names moved at the NBA's trade deadline.
I think it's very possible that maybe any Hornets player could be like if Hayward is moved, if Rozier is moved, right? Because they're pretty good despite that team being really awful. VanVleet was an all-star last year. So if he's moved, it's probably him, I would say, based on what's been talked about. But the Raptors' direction still not known. I think it's pretty clear what they should do given how their season has gone. But you see what everybody's saying, you don't really know. The trouble is, the reason I have trouble actually answering the real or fake is every year there's one guy that you're like, huh? Last year, like James Harden was kind of mentioned a little bit that he could get dealt, but last year was Porzingis, right? Everyone was like, Kristaps Porzingis got traded. Where did that come from? I didn't even know that was something the Mavs were considering, right? Like you never know who the guy. There's probably more than I'm even missing from last year, but that's the one that I remember. There's always one surprise guy. So if there's no surprise guys, based on what the reporting says about the way the league could be headed, VanVleet, maybe Mike Conley or Terry Rozier, one of those guys could be the big name. So I would say real based on what we've heard so far, but you never know. There's always one team that gets the offer. They go, okay, we've got to do that to change direction.
Yeah, and look, while things are finally starting to pick up, you need like one trade to set the dominoes falling. The Rui trade the other day was certainly that, and they talked about that on yesterday's show. It still doesn't like really heat up for like another 5-7 days, right? You need to kind of get into that like 10 days or less when there's like, oh, the deadline's coming. If we're going to make a move, we really need to make a move right now. It really does feel like it hinges on the Toronto Raptors. John and I talked about this on the show last week. He felt strongly they need to blow it up. It seems like you feel strongly they need to like blow it up and do something. I think they more need to retool. So I don't really, and with Masai, man, I don't know if they're going to blow it up and trade a guy like Anunoby or Siakam or some of those other real big name players off that team. You could really easily sell me on Gary Trent Jr. So I take kind of Fred VanVleet out of that mix there, but it feels like of the names that have been mentioned, like Rozier seems like he should be gone from that Hornets team. They're not good. They should absolutely be tanking, it feels like, for the number one overall pick. If you could pair LaMelo and Wemby, that's a fun team. Does his salary scare you at all? You know, he's making $25 million basically for the next like 4 years, just signed a new deal. Does that complicate things, do you think?
That is pretty rosy. That I just realized that sounds a lot like his name after I started to say
Was that not on purpose?
That is a lot of money. Like, the way the cap is going, I don't think teams are afraid of anybody making less than $30 million. It's going to be hard for that deal to be like cripplingly awful when the cap jumps in a few years. But in the immediate, it's pretty hefty for a guy that, you know, like Terry Rozier on a good team, right? He's just going to be a shooter, basically.
Yeah.
Right? He's not going to dribble all that much. So that's a lot of money. He'll be very, very good in that role, but that's a lot of money for that kind of guy. So it's hard to find the perfect team where, you know, there's a role for him to be a $25 million player that would give up the stuff for him. So it's a tricky balance, but he is good. And I think he's a pretty underrated player because the Hornets are awful and no one really, you know, sees it.
They're so bad. He's interesting, right? I actually just did a show on talking about him on the Pelicans, and it was like, are you really going to pay $25 million per season for like your fourth option? And a guy that maybe is going to be upset that he doesn't have the ball in his hands all the time, that he doesn't have kind of the same role that he once maybe did, where he can kind of at times on that Hornets team do whatever he wants. I think that makes it a little bit tricky, but like, he's a bucket getter, man. Like, that dude can go out and score for you if you need him. So if there's a team really looking for that, I think that could be a real big one. What about a name like, you know, okay, let me ask you about Miles Turner here, right? Like, that's a name that certainly in the trade market has been rumored for a while. There's finally a reason for them to trade him, given he's expiring. That going to happen finally? We finally going to get there?
Look, they have a scary chicken and egg situation, the Pacers do, right? They can extend him, and they can do this renegotiation and extension that no other team can do, right? So they can give him more money than anybody else. If they want to keep him, they've got the means to do it if Turner has an asking price, but they've got to ask if that's the direction they want to take, if that's the money they want to spend. And if they can't agree on an extension or the Turner price seems too high for them, they have to consider trading him, right? I've talked to you about that before. Like, because he's expiring, it's different than in years past where, like, you know, you can hold teams over a barrel for the price you want. Like, you have to think about it and actually do something if there is no extension. And sure, the extension deadline is after the trade deadline, but then the power's out of your hands, right? You were no longer the team that can make the decisions. It's Miles Turner's choice completely at that point. So they have to be careful about how they handle it. And if they can't agree to terms, they have to consider it.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. You know, there's also like a decision to be made on John Collins with the Atlanta Hawks. It feels like they need to do something. That team's pretty disappointing. He's a good player. They don't seem to really kind of have the right spot for him. That team's really disappointed. You know, they don't have a ton of future assets or anything like that after the Murray trade. You know, do you see them finally trading him? He's like the other big man that's been in conversations for like 4 years, it feels like, of potentially being traded.
Yeah, he's like what you just said with Rozier, where it's like a good player that would be a fourth option on a team that's like, I'm better than this, you know, in their head. And Collins was a 20-10 guy in his second year. I can't fault him for thinking that, but I also can't fault the Hawks looking at their roster for putting him in the role they have him in. So it kind of just everybody loses in that case. So maybe they do have to deal him, and he would be a good name on the move, I think, in the right role. But it's the same kind of thing with Rozier. He's in that odd tier where he's like a very good non-all-star level player that's like, what is the right fit and role, and what team is willing to give up stuff to put him in that spot, because that'll dictate how big of a move he truly is.
Yeah, for Rozier and him too, right? They're both under contract for multiple years, so kind of hits at the point that you were talking about with Miles Turner, right? Like, you don't need to trade him if you don't really want to. It's not like there's a threat of them walking, and maybe that raises the price. And if there's not a ton of sellers or things like that, maybe a team gets desperate and pays it, or maybe it just scares off everyone, and this ends up being kind of a quiet trade deadline. But it's going to be a fun next 2 weeks as we get into the lead up with that. There's going to be a lot of rumors. There's going to be hopefully some movement to keep things interesting. And of course, we'll be covering it here at Locked On NBA. So coming up next, It was a fun night in the league. It was a really fun night in the league. Let's look at some of the games, take the big picture approach with some of those teams. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On NBA. Before we get to that, though, today's episode of Locked On NBA is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is here, the NFL playoffs are here, and we're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. And new customers, join today to get started with a $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel has all of your favorite bets from the money line to the point spreads to the player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Makes watching those games more fun. You know a player's going to go off. He's going to get the win. Combine them into one for an even bigger payout. The app is absolutely awesome. Super easy to use. The app's also safe, secure as well. So football fans, NBA fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL and Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday covering all the biggest stories around the association. Biggest stories last night, Tony, might have been, it was just like a fun night on League Pass, wasn't it? I know we had games that we were covering, but as I was catching up on things, it's like, these are fun. Close games in the regular season are really fun. Let's start with your team, the Indiana Pacers, and what they did last night.
Yeah, crazy game. First of all, the Pacers needed this win so bad. I buried the lead by saying that they won 116-110. They beat Chicago. Pacers had lost 7 in a row entering this game. Since Haliburton got hurt, they've looked maybe like the worst team in the league, right? So they have desperately needed to find a solution to get a win. And in the second quarter, they were down by 21. And I thought this was not the night that win would be coming. But Chicago was playing on a back-to-back. They lost some legs and some steam in the second half. And this was all the Pacers kind of coalescing to finally looking like the guys they were when Haliburton was playing. In the second half, Miles Turner had 18 points in the third quarter alone. Benedict Mathurin was 7 for 8. They both finished with 26 points in this game. Were huge down the stretch. Mathurin hits a 3 to give the Pacers a lead with under 2 minutes to go. Then the Bulls tie it, and then he hits another layup to give the Pacers a lead on the very next possession. We're talking about a rookie who comes off the bench and is, he might be a 6th man of the year candidate. He's definitely a rookie of the year candidate, although Paolo seemingly will win that. But he's been absolutely killer for this team. He had this spirit about him in this game that Rick Carlisle was raving about. He was fantastic, and the Bulls collapsed. I mean, there were a couple moments where DeRozan was just beside himself, standing under the basket on the opposite end of the play, hands on his knees, just like, how did we lose that game? That's been the story of the Bulls season. So the Pacers, with some guys that really needed to step up, they desperately needed to win. They found a way to do it.
How excited are you for the Haliburton-Mathurin backcourt in the future once this team kind of starts to really kind of figure out what they're doing with Turner and like start building around those guys?
Yeah, maybe the best pairing the Pacers have had in a long time since, maybe PG and Roy Hibbert when they were both all-stars, or PG, David West, whoever you want to pick from that era. Oladipo and Sabonis never quite overlapped. I'm going too far back in time, but yeah, they're both special, right? Tyrese Haliburton, good chance to be an all-star this year. He's a 20-10 guy. He's 22. Benedict Mathurin's averaging 17.5 points per game and can give you 20 plus on any night and gets by routinely good defenders. He's 20, right? Their core is very nice. They're going to be very good for quite a long time once they really learn how to play together as well. So yeah, the Pacers finally on the right path in terms of a build strategy and having a direction. And they look really good. This win over the Bulls showed what Mathurin can do at his best.
Yeah, I wasn't too high on him in the draft, and I look very, very foolish now with how he's played this year. Let's move on to the Cleveland Cavaliers and the New York Knicks. This game was fun, back and forth. Knicks in control for the first half. You saw Cleveland really start to lead in the third before the Knicks came back, and then the Cavs tried to make it close at the end, but Julius Randle, 8 made threes. The Knicks are a really interesting team, I think. And if I look at one team that should be a huge buyer, it feels like them. Could they be really good? If you had put Donovan Mitchell, if they'd gone all in on that trade, how good would that team potentially be this year?
Very, right? They got what every team hopefully wants in the team building process. They got a really good player to sign with their team. You had to give up no assets to do that. They're 6th in the East, or maybe the Heat passed them, but they're right there for a good playoff team. They're one piece away from oh wow, Brunson's close to all-star level. Randall's been an all-star. Like, they've got stuff. They just need like one more thing, right, to really push themselves up in the standings.
Yeah, they're going to be an interesting one to watch at the trade deadline because they do have assets. For the Cavs, by the way, a little bit scary at the end with Donovan Mitchell, who made his return from the groin injury, hit the ground hard, slow to get up. He seemed okay, and hopefully there's not going to be anything kind of big dealing with that and with him. In the one of the other games, Luka Doncic and the Mavs waste a 41 performance from him. For all of the games, by the way, any night of the week, go check out the Locked On NBA game-to-game feed. We all do like a minute-long show after every game. You get the home and the away, the winner and the loser, their perspective on it. It was also a fun one here in New Orleans too, which I was at as the Pelicans took on the Denver Nuggets. Pelicans just falling short at the end, though, coming back from 19 down. But the real big news there, I think, if we're kind of just bouncing around the league in this segment, is you should get Brandon Ingram back, or the Pelicans should get Brandon Ingram back in Wednesday's game. They're playing on second night of the back-to-back against the Minnesota Timberwolves. That's huge. And then we got an update on Zion Williamson, too, who's been out for 3 weeks, just got some more imaging done on his hamstring, said it's healing well. They're focusing on strengthening it, and they're going to be looking at doing another reevaluation in 2 more weeks for him. So hopefully the team can just kind of limp into the All-Star game, get healthy, and then maybe make a run around it all. When I skipped over the Mavericks game there, Tony, but let's go back to that one for a second. Like, they could really use Jalen Brunson, couldn't they?
Yeah, I say this every time I'm on NBA talking about the Mavs. Like, I have a lot of trouble taking them serious, which stinks because Luka is so good, right? Top 3 MVP candidate. On nights, he's the best player in the league. On several nights, he's the best player in the league. But they lost Brunson, and they couldn't do a lot to replace him. That's how the rules work. But the pieces just aren't quite awesome. Like in a game like this, when he is that good, right? 41, right? Mm-hmm. And the Wizards don't have Kristaps Porzingis, right? Like you should be winning that game fairly handily. And they give up 41 foul attempts. Like they're just too slow with their rotations. The Wizards didn't even shoot that well from the field. The Mavs shot a better percentage from the field and, made one less 3. Like you should win that game when Luka goes off, but they couldn't. And they have a lot of trouble with supporting cast stuff. They can't quite put it together on both ends. It feels like every single game they're close. Like I can't quite take them serious yet, despite their good record, because they have so many games like this.
No, it's funny. And you and I did the show after he had the 60-point triple-double, and it took like every ounce. It was in overtime, and it took like every ounce of that to win a game. If you have a dude that puts up a 60-point triple-double, it feels like you should have just dominated that game, and they probably don't even come close to actually having that stat line because they were so good and you're so far ahead, and that just doesn't happen with them. Like, they basically would need Luka for what, to go on a 2-month-long hot streak to win the NBA title, which like I don't want to put it past him, but at the same point, that's really not all that likely to occur, I guess.
If you like crazy games, this one is for you. The biggest lead ever for either team was 8. 10 lead changes tied 18 times. Both teams led in the fourth quarter as the Wizards squeak it out. It was nuts. No team even had a double-digit lead, which in the NBA these days is unheard of.
Like we said, it was a fun night of action there. And also, if you want to know
you glossed over something big. You say you go back to that. Nikola Jokic at the buzzer. Back in the lineup after missing a few games, the reigning MVP. Not the buzzer. There was like 15 seconds left.
It was Jokic, like, I would call that a buzzer beater. It was a game-winning shot. New Orleans helped off him. That's one thing. I got to go record Locked On Pelicans after this, and I need to yell about this one a little bit because why do you do that? Like, why do you do that? I don't understand that. It was basically a pick and roll between Jokic and Murray, and you had Larry Nance Jr. on the switch covering Jamal Murray. He's doing a good job. He was contesting it, and then I forget who the other man was, just leaves Jokic and goes over to try and get the ball out of Murray's hands, and he's like, yeah, I'll happily give it up. Just hits it to Jokic in the middle, who just puts it in.
Triple-double, returning from injury. That Jokic guy's pretty good, and he has other good players on his team, so I can take the Nuggets seriously. Jake,
yeah, I take them. Someone asked me that the other day. I was on another show, and someone was like, do you take them seriously given their like postseason they've done before? And I'm like, I don't know. Jokic just lost in the first round once. He's never had like a fully healthy team around him in the postseason, right? Like, yeah, they're really good. He's going to win his 3rd straight MVP. We talked about it last week, and it puts him in like all-time great talk, like all-time great talk, right? Like top 1% of NBA players. And it's a little weird because he doesn't have a title, but I don't think it's his
He
fault.
didn't have a finals appearance.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't think that's his fault. He's so good. He's so good. There
He's
you go.
He's literally unguardable at this stage. Like it's actually like funny talking about the Nuggets because when he comes out, like the way Jokic is so good, you have to play a certain way because it's like, oh, he's so good at this. But they can't play that way without him. So it doesn't matter who their bench players are; they're just bad because
that's when New Orleans went on their run. It was they took advantage of the minutes that Jokic wasn't out there on the court, which is like the only way you can beat that Nuggets team right now is you've just got to kill them in the minutes that he's not out there because. Well, yeah, like the on-off numbers are stupid with him. Their net rating with him on the court versus off the court, and if you look at the wins projection with him on versus their next closest player, it's like a 50-win differential or something like that, and it's just bananas how important he is to that team.
It is. One more awesome game. Celtics lead by 10 with 8 minutes and 45 seconds left against the no Jimmy Butler Miami Heat. In rivalry week, I believe is what the NBA is calling it. I don't know if anyone cares about that part of it.
Wait, is that a thing they're doing?
No Jaylen Brown for the Celtics, no Jimmy Butler for the Heat. You'd still think, though, a 10-point lead for one of the best defensive teams in the league, they could hang on to that. They didn't. Credit the Heat immediately go on a 15-0 run and hang on for dear life. It was 95-95 in the final minute before a Bam Adebayo bucket and a Haywood Highsmith free throw got it done for the Miami Heat. They need every win they can get. They've had to scrap and claw all season, but they've quietly moved into 6. They're out of the play-in. So you buying the Heat as an out of the play-in level team?
Yeah, I think so. I've just gotten to see them a couple times as the Pelicans played them, and they can make it click when they need to. It just depends on what Jimmy Butler are you getting, how much of Jimmy Butler are you getting, and can those other guys step up? And in the right moments, they can definitely do it. Celtics also sometimes play down to their opponent too, I think, a little bit, which definitely added to that one. All right, it was a busy night. It was a fun night. Go check out Locked On Game to Game NBA to get a little bit more in depth. And don't forget, we got a Locked On show for every one of these teams as well. If you want to hear the local angle on them, the boots on the ground coverage that only Locked On can provide. So coming up next, good job, Sacramento Kings. They did the right thing. We love to see that, particularly for small markets with two small market guys here on the show. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On NBA. And thank you for making Locked On NBA your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday breaking down the biggest stories around the association. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Game to Game. I just mentioned it. After every night, if you want to recap, sometimes there's 13 games. We got a quick show that's going to get it all done in 30 minutes, give you the home, the away perspective, the winning, the losing perspective, and the big picture around those teams. Tony. We love small markets here, right? We love small markets. Indianapolis, New Orleans here. The Sacramento Kings third in the West, but they made the right thing extending general manager Monte Morris. Yes, just clap for him, everybody. Like, take a second, just clap for the Sacramento Kings for not screwing this up. Sorry, not Monte Morris, Monte McNair. Whatever. And good job. Just ownership getting out of their own way, embracing that this team is good. He was out of contract at the end of this year. They had to do something. Do you really want to play with fire? They seem like they're going to make the playoffs. They had their best record that they've had since 2006. This would be the first time they've made the postseason since the iPhone has existed, which is one of my favorite stats. Wow. Good job, Kings, for just doing the right thing and extending the dude who's built the team like this.
Yeah, very, very quietly built up stuff. And he's lauded for a lot of the moves this year, which he should be. They're, again, third, fourth in the West right now? I don't remember their exact.
Third at 27-19. They
smoked the Grizzlies, who are awesome. They won like 10 in a row or whatever. They smoked them 2 nights ago, right? Like, they're playing awesome. The Halliburton trade, of course, I see the other side of that, but has been fantastic for them. Like, they get way too killed for that. Sabonis has been an awesome fit with De'Aaron Fox. Their offense is lethal because of that. Keegan Murray looks great. Perfect pick for what they needed. Can shoot the ball and do all these things. Kevin Huerter trade, home run, knock it out of the park. He's been a perfect fit with the way they want to play. And of course, maybe the biggest one, hiring Mike Brown, the right head coach for a team in their position that just needs like a kick in the pants kind of coach who's been there on good teams, who's made it to the finals before. I don't think they're a finals level team, but for a franchise that's this desperate for any sort of run like this, like even if they finish sixth, like if they stumble in the second half and finish sixth, monumental season for them, given the last 20 years. Like that he's been fantastic, especially recently. Well-deserved front office extensions. Those guys have done a great job.
This is just, it's so smart, right? It's a no-brainer. Like we don't need to overthink this. We could just clap for a couple of minutes and that's the right thing to do here. You also signed Malik Monk. That was a great signing for him. That's a guy who's gotten them a lot of points. You mentioned Mike Brown being the right head coach. I didn't like that move at the time. And then you've kind of also seen Mike Brown reinvent himself. This is a defensive first coach, right? They're not good defensively. I've watched a lot of the Kings. They're not good defensively. And he's just leaned into the offense thing, right? Like they just put up points, man. They play fast. They're just a whole lot of fun. For a head coach who's on his, third, fourth stop, something like that, to kind of reinvent himself, I think he probably needs a little bit more credit in like the coach of the year running, and we don't hear his name mentioned whatsoever with that. But look, this aligns McNair and Brown on the same length of their contracts. We've always seen that if, a new GM comes in and he didn't pick that head coach, does that ever end well? So this kind of puts everyone on the same page. It just syncs them up like that. Their owner has sometimes meddled a little bit too much and made the wrong moves and overthought things. Like the worst thing for the Kings would have been they make the postseason and then McNair gets poached and goes elsewhere because he's out of contract and they tried to be cheap or whatever. Just sometimes you got a dude who's doing the right thing, like pay him and keep the momentum going.
Agreed. And that synergy between coach and GM is very important, right? There's always talk about people having their guy running the team, all that sort of stuff. And like I said, this kind of predates just this year, even though this year's been the year. Like, they don't get the bonus if McNair, who was hired in late 2020, doesn't draft Halliburton, right, in that draft. Like, getting a guy like that is massively important to all this stuff. Like, they've done a lot of stuff well along the way as well. They made a savvy Marvin Bagley trade. Trey Lyles has been a piece for them. They've got some future picks coming in that way. And he didn't pick Marvin Bagley. That was a mistake, but he didn't make it, right? He figured out what to do to move the team forward from that, right? All sorts of little things you can point to like that. Matt George on Locked On Kings can tell you all of them much better than I can, but every little thing kind of matters when you're trying to build up something from nothing. And they have done a really good job kind of every step of the way of getting the right, even at like Alex Len signing as a backup big, right? All sorts of little things. Tristan Thompson was helpful for them at times. Terrence Davis was a good pickup from the Raptors. Like all these little things you could point to over and over again to get the team to where they are now. That's what makes a good GM. The big things are obviously important, but nailing everything to get your team to third in the West when people thought they'd be better, but not this much better.
No one. Look, no one believes in the Kings. Like let's not lie here. Even Matt George, who you mentioned, who's one of the more awesome dudes I think on our network here, doesn't really believe in the Kings a lot of the time. Like no one expected this, right? Like the Keegan Murray pick is really interesting too, right? Because the knock on him was he doesn't have a very high ceiling, right? That was kind of the big thing of why maybe you don't take him at that spot, 5, 6 overall, something like that. And he goes, this is just a dude who's going to be a real good NBA player. And I've got Fox and I've got Sabonis, and I don't need, another to go for a swing at an all NBA guy necessarily. And he just made the right pick. And Murray's been so good for them, Just those type of moves and that kind of foresight and kind of like, I almost hate to say this, like trusting your process is probably the way to go, especially in a small market team. With that, you're smiling at me, but yeah,
they're like backup center away from like a damn good rotation of 9, 10, whatever number of dudes to put out there on a given game. Right, that's been their only big wart all year. When Sabonis is out, it's like, oh, so they figure that out, and they've got it. The other thing about extending your GM is like, this happened a lot in Orlando because they had a couple GMs along the way when their rebuild wasn't going well. It's like they're not GMing for their job anymore, right? They can continue to go with a long-term approach and make smart moves instead of like, crap, I need to get this awesome player in the door to save my job. That no longer a thing that the Kings have to worry about. They can build for the future and things like that. So that synergy is also important, and they've got that ready for the deadline.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun close in the West. As you mentioned in that beginning segment, we were talking buyers and sellers. Like, there's a lot of competition there, and we'll see if anyone makes a move and really starts to kind of separate themselves and stand out. But it's going to be a fun close in second half of the NBA season. That's going to do it, though, for the Wednesday episode of Locked On NBA. On Wednesdays, I'm your co-host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and the host of the Locked On Pelicans podcast.
I'm Tony East at TEastNBA on Twitter, host of Locked On Pacers. Tomorrow, you'll, of course, see Nick Angstad and Pat the Designer talking all things NBA here on Locked On NBA. Till then, everybody, have a great rest of your day.